Hi, good evening. Oh, good afternoon. My name is Sanford Schwartz. I'm a graduate of the Fordham Graduate School of Social Work, class of 2005, I think. It was a long time ago. I've been asked to tell you a little bit about what I've done with my graduate degree. Not because you'd have any interest in trying to do what I did, but more because maybe you'd pick up some tidbits about things and try to find your own path. Each of us is on our own journey and have our own paths. I have two goals in today's session. The first goal is to hopefully give you some insight about ways that you can craft your careers. And the second goal is to not bore you too much. So if it looks like I'm really boring you, just raise your hand and ask any type of question on any topic, and we'll try to keep things going. So I probably should tell you a little bit about my background. From the time I was a young child, I was always interested in businesses, how they worked, who ran them, how do you make money, how do employees work together, what were the best businesses, what were the worst businesses. And my first memory of a business I had, I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. And I remember going into a supermarket and buying a dozen cans of, I'm not a soda drinker, but a dozen cans of lower priced soda. And it cost me, and this was a long time ago, but let's say it cost me 10 cents a can. And I took the dozen cans of soda, put it in my parents' refrigerator for an hour or two, then walked over to a beach that wasn't far away from where I lived and was able to sell them between 20 cents and 25 cents. Now, it wasn't a lot of money, but I was 10 years old, and it gave me enough pocket change. And just think about from 10 years old to today, everything should get multiplied by 8 times. So if I made $1 would be $8. Then when I became a teenager, I started to become familiar with more sophisticated terms like debt and entrepreneurs and bankruptcy and loan forgiveness and some things which I understood a little bit and some things that I didn't understand all that well. Please come in. And when you finish, there's a sign-up sheet over there, and we can get to it then. So I used to read everything that I could about businesses, and I read that the United States Mint had changed how dimes were produced. So in 1964, until 1964, if you had a dime, and if you have one of those 1964 and before, you'd realize that they were 90% silver, or they were silver dimes, and there was some 10% copper. And then starting in 1965, the United States Mint stopped using silver and started using copper and aluminum and other less valuable metals to make dimes. And I'd read in the paper that there were brokerages and stores of all type, coin dealerships, that would buy old pre-64 dimes for 10% above. So $1, you'd get $1.10. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's it's an immediate return of 10%, which annualizes a big number. And without discussing it with my parents, I had a conversation with a family friend who I had always talked to him about businesses, and asked him if I could borrow $2,000. And remember, I was a 16-year-old kid, and he said, okay. He kind of knew my parents. He figured if I lost the money, maybe he can go to them, or I'm not sure why, or maybe just had trust in me. And I vividly remember walking into a bank in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. It was called the Dime Savings Bank, ironically. And I walked into the Dime Savings Bank, introduced myself. They told me that they had spoken with, the guy's name was Irving, and they handed me 2 bags. One bag each had $1,000 worth of dimes. So I walked out of the bank with 20,000 dimes. Now, remember, everything was worth 7.5, 8 times what it's worth today. So it was a lot of money. And I was 16 years old, and I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't have a car. So I hailed a cab, went home, immediately went to my bedroom, and started sorting out the silver ones from the non-silver ones. And at first, the crop was great. And within a day, I'd be able to pick up $1,000 worth of silver dimes. And today, it seems like an unbelievable amount of work, but when I was a 16-year-old kid, it seemed like a fantastic journey. And within a day, I was able to make $100. And $100 is worth, in today's dollars, $750. And for a 16-year-old kid, I was living in clover. And I held on to, then I realized, why am I selling these to somebody for 10%? So I was reading in the paper that the price of silver was going up. So I decided to just sort as many as I could and store them in my closet. And one day, I'm not sure if you know this, but coins have an odor. If you put a handful of coins together, they smell. And I guess it was driving my parents crazy where the odor was coming from. Turned out to be coming from my closet in my bedroom. And they were a little surprised once I explained the whole story to them and asked me to sell everything, which I did, and paid back Irving. But as a young kid, I had an interest in business, and eventually I graduated from high school and graduated from college and earned a Ph.D. in sociology. But at each stage of my life, I continued to have an interest in business. And at 50 years old, I decided that I think I'd like to become a social worker. I'm still married to a clinical psychologist, and saw the great things that she was doing with helping people. And I figured, well, maybe I could do a little bit of that, or if nothing else, I could have more intelligent conversations with my wife. And by that stage of my life, I had already bought or sold more than a dozen companies. And along the way, I had opportunities to meet some interesting people. And I realized that one of the most valuable things I was doing with these companies that I was involved with was listening to what people had to say. Sometimes they were talking about personal problems, and sometimes about business problems and coworkers and other things. And I didn't do much other than listen, and realize that listening, you should all learn this, listening is a very valuable skill. And along the way, I wound up acquiring a company where there were 2 owners, and they had a fabulously successful business. But the 2 owners couldn't stand being with each other. And they couldn't stand being with each other so much that they wound up moving their offices, and one moved to Suffern and one moved to Mahwah. Close enough that they could commute, but far enough away that they didn't have to breathe each other every day. And after I wound up acquiring, and they wound up selling the business because they couldn't figure out how to work together. And my primary role in that business, every Thursday morning, I would go and spend some time with them. I'd usually spend 3 hours in which they'd pretty much scream at each other and accuse each other and argue like cats and dogs. It was a man. Then I would, fortunately, after 3 hours, I'd get a chance to leave and I didn't have to come back to the following week. But the business was doing great. Fast forward 5 years, 7 years, one of the partners dies. And I go to his funeral, and at the funeral, there was only one person giving the eulogy. And the wife of the person who died introduces the person who's giving the eulogy, and she says, giving the eulogy today is my husband's, I won't use their name, my husband's longtime business partner and best friend. And it just sort of blew me away that these two people lived this life that they had to work in separate buildings, they couldn't stand being together, and they considered one another best friends. And that sort of taught me a little bit about things, and what's always on the surface isn't exactly how things are operating. Then, while I was in my third year of social work school, I decided, which was my final year, I had this epiphany that I was going to try to work with families on some family business issues. At first, I thought that I would try to work with families on intergenerational wealth transfer issues. I remember reading in the paper that this generation of people is going to be contributing trillions of dollars to the next generation. And I figured, well, that could be a start. And then after I met with a few families, I realized that people don't like to, at least the people I met, didn't like to talk about transferring wealth. So that was a failed venture. It's a very sensitive topic. So I'm usually not the type of person that immediately quits once I run into a roadblock. So I said, well, there are quite a few family businesses. In fact, there are over 20 million family businesses just in the United States. And half of all companies in the United States and half of all employees in the United States work for family businesses. And some of those family businesses are what you think of as little mom and pop cleaning stores, luncheonettes, hardware stores. And some of them are the world's largest companies, the Fords and the Marriotts and the Walmarts and the Facebooks of the world are all family businesses by the definition that if you're a public company, 32% of the voting shares of the company have to be controlled by the family. So Walmart, which you don't think of as a family business, is a family-owned business. And I then started to develop some traction because I had this background in business and I had this background in social work. And I started finding the opportunity to work with a few companies. And I thought I'd tell you just about 2 case studies. Pretty soon I'll stop talking and give you a chance to be more interactive. Raise your hand if you're totally bored yet. Well, I haven't lost, or no one's sleeping back there either. That's good. So I'll give you 2 examples of companies. One was a very small mom and pop business, which was in the home security business. They installed alarm systems in people's homes. And it was a nice little business. The husband and wife had founded it 30 years before. They had 2 adult sons who worked in the business. One of the sons worked with clients, sold contracts, prepared things if they didn't work out, assisted the parents with the bookkeeping part. And the other son wasn't as excited about the business, and he worked on building the systems. His real passion was in automotives, and he viewed coming to work as a problem. And that was becoming an issue for the family because one son, both the sons were, let's say, in their 40s. It was a number of years ago. They may have been late 30s, doesn't matter. But it was becoming an issue for the parents because they were getting older in life and figuring out what was going to happen with the company. And there was one son that clearly was engaged, and the other one wishes that he was someplace else. So I spent a few sessions with them and provided them with a suggestion for a plan that parents give 25% of the business to each of the sons, and each of the sons got a 25% distribution of any profits that came out of the business. And the one son who was involved in working the business would get a salary and a bonus and work in the business and be incented to help it grow. And the other son would move off and get a job as an auto mechanic, which he did. And the whole family gets along better at Thanksgiving than they used to get along, and everybody was sort of happy, and their spouses were happy, and things worked out okay. It wasn't that it was a brilliant idea, but it was a different way that the parents hadn't seen of, or giving them permission to sort of split the business up in a different way. And then another company I worked with, I wound up working with them for 9 years, first as a counselor to the patriarch of the company and then on the board of advisors of the business. And that's a company that was in the real estate business, and they owned 20,000 apartments both in the metropolitan area and across the rest of the country. And it was a complicated situation because there were 5 children, 3 sons in the business, 3 different children from 3 different marriages, issues related to substance abuse, criminology, mental illness, outside employees working for the company, skill sets, different skill sets that the sons brought to the business. And after 9 years of working with them, they finally asked me to move on. And not because I was the sole contributor to things working out okay, but the family figured out how to sort out their succession planning issues, sort out the working issues between the siblings, figured out the distribution issues between the 5 children, brought in outside management to help with running the company. And again, I wasn't the only player or a crucial player, but I was able to provide a perspective. And probably the main benefit I brought to the company was basically giving the patriarch of the business, who first retained me, permission to make the decisions that he thought were right for the company and that he was going to live with best. And it turned out that his instincts were right. So that's 2 case studies of businesses that I had worked with. And then I thought that since I've done 100% of the talking, I thought that maybe we could make things a little bit more interactive. I'm happy to write on the whiteboard, even though I have terrible penmanship. But maybe if you could provide me with some of your thoughts about what are some of the issues of, if you think I need to write on the whiteboard, I will. If you think not, then I won't. We'll find out. Okay. What are some of the issues that surface when you're working with a family business or even a family? Yes.
There are divided loyalties, and how do you balance all of that?
Correct. Good. Come on. So basic things that you think about would be, yes.
I think when you work with families, sometimes there's resistance and people not wanting to take accountability for like what they contributed to what the presenting problem is. And I think that if you add a business aspect to it, where then you're adding in money, financials, like how things are being run, it's like a whole nother layer to what would contribute to the issue.
Thank you. Yes.
Much more personal. So it's like these are the people that like you're not only doing business with, but you're spending your holidays with, and like we all know that like conversations about work and life all come up, like not only at your job, but when you're at home. So it's like if these people are the same, it can create a lot of.
Thank you. Good. I should ask one question. In this room, how many people here at some point in their life were involved in a family where the family had a business? So that's about 10 out of 25, maybe. Good. Other things. So sort of the first thing that I thought you would have thought about is, who's the client?
That's when I said divided loyalties, where you have to balance that. Who's the client?
Yeah. So, and who's your responsibility to? So as if someone retains you as a therapist, you know, there are issues about, what are the issues about confidentiality? Right? And you know, questions, suggestions?
Who do you trust with handling the money?
Who do you trust with handling the money? That's right. We're not talking about the money to the therapist. We're talking about the family business. Sure. So in some businesses, there are strong financial controls. Some businesses, less so. And that can lead to lots of problems, which I guess brings up another issue is, what's the issue for which you're retained? Not every business needs a consultant or a social worker to come in and help them, even though we might think that we're required everywhere. But you know, what are some of the issues? And my experience has been most of the issues have to do with the interpersonal relationships between the family members, and most parents aren't interested in having their family destroyed because there are problems in their businesses. And what social work is usually brought in for is to mediate those sorts of issues. The same as in a company. And when employees don't get along well, that usually leads to bad things for the business. What about issues related to family employees versus outside employees? You know, it's, yes?
Just being able to differentiate your role in the company and your role in the family.
Absolutely. Both from the parental point of view, as well as the child, first-generation child or second-generation.
You say siblings are like a big one, like that, I could say like the most problems, like around siblings.
Well, siblings and also spouses of siblings. As people move ahead in life, they frequently get married, and sometimes spouses get along well with all the siblings, sometimes not so well. Sometimes the spouses don't get along well with the other spouses, both male and female. Sometimes they get along too well. But things get complicated. What about employment qualifications? So some employees, some siblings bring greater aptitude, greater energy, greater interest to businesses than others. And how do you acknowledge or reward siblings who are contributing more to a business and siblings who are not? If they weren't blood, you would stagger compensation. You'd have no problem staggering compensation differently. But when you have siblings involved in the business, it's a much more complicated situation. And of course, there's the issue of succession planning. Who's going to take over? Who owns it? Should the family business continue to the next generation, or should the business just be sold off? And there's another issue which doesn't get as much attention as it should get, which is bringing in outside advisors to help with solving business issues and family issues. And I'm not sure, is anyone familiar with the store Forever 21?
Yes.
So, yeah, last week there was an article in the Times, this article in the Times, that Forever 21, which was a startup business a couple of decades ago, started with nothing by a Korean family, the Changs, and they grew a business from zero to $4 billion in sales. And they operated globally, and then over time, they made some decisions that hurt the business, and they're closing up, and they had 43,000 employees. They're closing up operations in 30 countries around the world, and they're reducing 30% of the stores in the United States. And I'm going to read you a quote from some faculty member, management expert at the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business, who said they didn't have a board of directors to give them a reality check, and they didn't have equity analysts to give them a reality check. So if a public company would have equity analysts that would be critical of decisions that the business makes, in a private company, there aren't outsiders. It's privately controlled, but many private businesses that haven't gone public bring in a board of advisors, the way I was brought into that real estate company, to help guide them with decisions. And that clearly was helped me as a niche for the little business that I was able to set up. So maybe we should migrate, talking about businesses, think about what are just general good social work practices to help you in, let's say that you were interested in geriatrics or geriatric music or art with children, or you wanted to carve out some niche with your own practice. What's the first thing required to carve out your own niche? Yes.
I think you have to become an expert.
Yes. You have to become an expert. And then the next thing? Competence. Next thing? Passion. So if you don't have passion for things, you might be really smart at something and understand it well. But if you're not passionate about it, you're going to lose interest quick. First, that's going to come across to your clients. But second, you're going to lose interest.
And the story for the reason for starting the business.
Yep. Yes. And what are some of the other skills that you need to bring to the table? Just to be a good social worker, yes.
It's not a skill, but you need funds, you need people to back the business. You need money, investors.
Yeah. Yes and no. If to get one client, you don't need a business. You just, I remember when my wife and I were starting out many years ago, and she was worried about taking some office space, and I said, well, if you just had 2 clients a week, you'd be, our overhead was small, you'd be able to pay your bills. And fortunately, things worked out a little better than 2 a week, but it shouldn't be. If you believe in yourself and you think you have an idea, then you shouldn't be afraid to try to embark upon the journey. But in terms of social work skills, what are some of the most important skills that translate into anything you're going to do? Honesty, yes.
Understanding that there's not everything of the business that you are aware of, and so just try to get home or try to get a better understanding. So this way it can be run more smoothly.
Absolutely, yes. Empathy, excellent. None of us could be social workers if we didn't have empathy. Engagement, absolutely. Something I said earlier, which is listening, active listening. I remember when I was doing my second year of clinical training, I was at down the street at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And I was fortunate to be in some seminar with a very intelligent psychiatrist. And I was the only social worker. The rest of the people were postdoc clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. Somehow just because I guess I was older and they mixed me up with somebody else, I snuck into the seminar. And I remember him saying that if you listen, truly listen to what your clients are saying, you'll understand 90 or 95% of their problem and figure out their solution. But most of us have trouble truly, actively listening. Yes. So what are some of the other skills that are required? Absolutely. Conflict resolution. Another one I think about regularly is boundary setting. Very easy to try to get sucked into a situation where clients are trying to, especially in a family situation, a dynamic when there are multiple parties, to get on your favored side, which is something that we all need to be aware of as we move ahead with our clinical careers. And one other, well, two other things. One is tolerance. We're always not going to like the people that we're working with. We may not like their political views. We may not like how they've lived their family life, how they treat their kids, how they treated by their parent, or whatever the issues are. But we need to be open-minded and tolerant, or else we can't service the clients. And one other point which is important that you take away is that communication, both verbally, written, how you coordinate things, creating a system that you're going to actively communicate with your clients. One of the little, I shouldn't say tricks, one of the skills or techniques I've always used is at the end of a session with people or with groups, I tried to summarize and wrap up what we had discussed and provide people with an opportunity to comment on it if they heard things differently, which is a segue into, we're coming to the end of our session, and so I told you a little bit about my background, how my background became an avenue for me to create a little niche in becoming a social worker, and how I tried to use that niche to help out clients, and how I tried to draw upon standard social work skills while I was working with people, and they were invaluable. Did anyone hear anything else? Or are there any questions that you had about either this session, or is there any more pizza or anything else?
How did you get your first client?
Thank you for asking that question. I had a few friends who I told about what I was doing, and most of them kind of laughed at me. And but I had a few attorney friends, and my attorney friends realized that they had clients who were struggling with issues, and they could perhaps improve their situation by having an outside mediator, confidant, consultant, therapist talk to them. So those were one way. And then I started attending, I joined a number of different groups of people, and some were small business owners, some were therapist groups, and I started talking to people, and out of that I got a few different clients. Also, I should point out that I retained the services of one of my faculty members from Fordham to be a consultant to me. And I would, every time I got a couple of cases, every couple of weeks or once a month, I'd meet with that person and go through the cases and get some counseling. Because even though I was old and had a fair amount of experience, I didn't have a fair amount of experience in social work. So I was able to draw upon that person's skills. Any other questions? Yes?
Would you have done anything differently?
Many things I would have done differently. Thank you. In individual cases, there were many where somewhere I wished I had never taken the case, and others where I'd handled things in a certain way. I wish I would have handled them differently. One of the worst cases I ever had was also in the real estate business, where there were two female owners of a business, and they weren't sisters. They weren't married to each other, but sometimes you'd think that they were. And somewhere along the way, I guess there was a situation where one of them had a extramarital relationship with the business partner's spouse, and that became a very complicated situation, which I was not able to solve. So, now, you don't always know what you're going to get into. Any other questions? Yes?
I ask practical questions.
Sure.
How did you bill your clients, on an hourly basis, on
Sure.
a fee basis? What
Sure.
sort of
I chose to bill my clients on an hourly basis. For social workers, I think my fee was high. For business consultants, my fee was low. And I saw what my wife was charging, so I figured I'll just charge that. And I didn't lose any, to the best of my knowledge, I didn't lose cases because my fee was high, because I'd always be willing to operate on a sliding scale if the business needed it. And I had wide ranges of businesses that were struggling to those that were very successful. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.